In the early autumn of 1914, as the leaves began their gentle descent from the trees of northern France, the fate of Paris hung by the most delicate of threads. The German armies, like a steel tide, had swept through Belgium and were now bearing down upon the French capital with the relentless precision of a well-oiled machine. The sound of artillery could be heard in the distance, a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the City of Light. Yet in this moment of supreme crisis, when all seemed lost and the enemy stood at the gates, salvation would come from the most unlikely of sources: a fleet of humble Parisian taxicabs. The story of the taxis of the Marne, as it would come to be known, begins not with the dramatic requisition of vehicles on a September night, but rather with the grand strategic calculations that had brought Europe to the brink of catastrophe. It is a tale that weaves together the ambitions of generals, the courage of common soldiers, and the desperate ingenuity of men faced with impossible circumstances. To understand how taxicabs came to play a role, however small, in one of the most crucial battles of the Great War, we must first journey back to the planning rooms of the German General Staff, where Count Alfred von Schlieffen had crafted what he believed to be the perfect solution to Germany's greatest strategic nightmare. The shadow of encirclement. Germany in the early years of the 20th century found itself in a position that would have given even the most confident military planner pause for thought. To the west lay France, still nursing the wounds of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and burning with a desire for revenge. To the east stretched the vast expanse of Russia, with its seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower and its growing alliance with the French Republic. The nightmare scenario that haunted German strategic thinking was simple, yet terrifying. A war on two fronts, with German forces divided and overwhelmed by the combined might of the Franco-Russian alliance. Count Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff from 1891 to 1906, was a man of methodical mind and relentless logic. He understood that Germany's salvation lay not in defensive measures, but in the swift application of overwhelming force against one enemy before the other could fully mobilize. His solution, refined over years of careful planning and calculation, was elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its audacity. The Schlieffen Plan, as it would be known to history, was based on a fundamental observation about the geography and military capabilities of Germany's potential enemies. Russia, for all its vast manpower, was a ponderous giant. Its railway network was primitive by European standards, its mobilization procedures slow and cumbersome. Schlieffen calculated that it would take the Russian bear at least 6 weeks, perhaps as long as 2 months, to bring its full strength to bear on Germany's eastern frontier. France, by contrast, was compact, well organized, and possessed of an excellent railway system that would allow for rapid mobilization. The logic was inescapable. Germany must strike at France first, achieving a swift and decisive victory before Russia could intervene effectively. But here lay the problem that had confounded German planners for decades. The Franco-German frontier was heavily fortified, a chain of fortresses and defensive positions that stretched from the Swiss border to the Belgian frontier. Any direct assault on these positions would be costly in time and blood, precisely what Germany could not afford in a war where speed was everything. Schlieffen's solution was to bypass these fortifications entirely. Instead of attacking where the French expected him to attack, he would sweep through the neutral territories of Belgium and Luxembourg, perhaps even the Netherlands, in a vast wheeling movement that would bring German armies around behind the French fortifications and down upon Paris from the north and west. The bulk of the German army, some 70% of its total strength, would be concentrated on this right wing, creating an irresistible hammer blow that would crush French resistance in a matter of weeks. The plan was inspired by the great Carthaginian general Hannibal's victory over the Romans at Cannae in 216 BCE, where a smaller force had destroyed a much larger enemy through superior tactics and positioning. Schlieffen envisioned his right wing sweeping south and west like the closing jaws of a great vice, enveloping the French armies and destroying them in a single, climactic battle of encirclement. Paris would fall, France would be knocked out of the war, and Germany could then turn its full attention to dealing with Russia. It was a plan of breathtaking scope and ambition, requiring precise timing, flawless execution, and perhaps most critically, the cooperation of enemies who might not behave exactly as German planners expected them to behave. The violation of Belgian neutrality would almost certainly bring Britain into the war, but Schlieffen calculated that this was a price worth paying for swift victory over France. The Belgian army was small and poorly equipped. Surely it could offer no more than token resistance to the German juggernaut. When Schlieffen retired in 1906, the plan passed to his successor, the younger Helmuth von Moltke. Moltke, nephew of the great Prussian general who had masterminded victory in the Franco-Prussian War, was a more cautious man than his predecessor. He modified Schlieffen's plan in several significant ways, reducing the strength of the right wing and keeping more troops on the eastern frontier to guard against a possible Russian advance. These modifications would prove crucial when the plan was finally put into action in August 1914. The lamps go out. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the Great War, the Schlieffen Plan moved from the realm of theory to that of harsh reality. As the July crisis deepened and the alliance system of Europe began to activate like a vast and terrible machine, German planners found themselves committed to a course of action that would determine the fate of millions. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, German armies crossed the Belgian frontier and the modified Schlieffen Plan began its deadly work. The small Belgian army, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a courage and tenacity that surprised and delayed the German advance. The fortress city of Liège, which Schlieffen had expected to fall within days, held out for nearly 2 weeks. Each day of delay was precious time for the French and British to complete their mobilization and prepare their defenses. The German advance, when it finally got underway in earnest, was initially everything that Schlieffen had envisioned. German armies swept through Belgium and into northern France with devastating effect. The small British expeditionary force, barely 100,000 men strong, found itself caught in the path of the German steamroller and was forced to fight a series of desperate rearguard actions as it fell back toward Paris. The French, caught off guard by the speed and weight of the German assault, saw their own plans for an offensive into Alsace-Lorraine crumble as they were forced to rush troops northward to meet the unexpected threat. The German First Army, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, formed the tip of the spear driving toward Paris. Behind Kluck came the Second Army under General Karl von Bülow, and behind Bülow, the Third, Fourth, and Fifth Armies, all wheeling southward in the great enveloping movement that Schlieffen had conceived. For the watching world, it seemed as though the German war machine was unstoppable. City after city fell to the advancing grey tide. Belgian refugees streamed southward with tales of destruction and atrocity. In Paris, the government of President Raymond Poincaré made the painful decision to evacuate to Bordeaux, leaving the capital to whatever fate awaited it. Yet even as the German armies pressed forward with seemingly irresistible momentum, subtle changes were taking place that would ultimately prove decisive. The pace of the advance was exhausting for the German troops, who had been marching and fighting almost continuously for weeks. Supply lines stretched thin as the armies moved farther from their railheads. Most critically of all, the very success of the advance was beginning to create new opportunities for their enemies. The Tiger of France. At the head of the French war effort stood a man whose calm demeanor and unshakable composure would prove to be one of France's greatest assets in her hour of supreme peril. General Joseph-Jacques Césaire Joffre commander-in-chief of the French armies, was a soldier of the old school, a man who had risen through the ranks during France's colonial campaigns and who possessed an almost mystical faith in the French soldiers' capacity for victory. Where others saw disaster in the German advance, Joffre saw opportunity. Joffre was not a brilliant strategist in the mold of Napoleon or Frederick the Great. His genius lay rather in his ability to remain calm under pressure, to see the broader picture when others were overwhelmed by immediate crises, and to make the hard decisions that victory often requires. As the German armies pressed southward and panic began to spread through French ranks, Joffre displayed the iron nerve that would earn him lasting fame. The French plan for the opening of the war, known as Plan 17th, had envisioned a great offensive into the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, reclaiming the territory that France had surrendered to Germany in 1871. It was a plan born more of national emotion than of strategic wisdom, and the German attack through Belgium had rendered it not merely obsolete, but positively dangerous. While French armies advanced into the teeth of German defences in the east, the real threat was developing far to the north and west. Joffre's first great contribution to French survival was his recognition that Plan 17th had failed and his willingness to abandon it entirely. With a ruthlessness that shocked many of his contemporaries, he dismissed generals who showed too much attachment to the original plan or who failed to display the offensive spirit that he demanded. 3 army commanders, 10 corps commanders, and 38 divisional commanders were relieved of their duties in the opening weeks of the war, to be replaced by more aggressive leaders like Ferdinand Foch, Louis Franchet d'Espèrey, and Henri-Philippe Pétain. But Joffre's greatest achievement was his ability to create order out of chaos, to construct a new plan from the wreckage of the old. As French and British forces fell back before the German advance, Joffre began the delicate task of redeploying his armies to meet the real threat. Using France's excellent railway network, he shifted troops from the eastern frontier to the threatened sectors in the north and west. It was a complex operation, requiring precise coordination and flawless timing, but it was executed with a skill that would have done credit to any military genius. At the same time, Joffre began to perceive that the German advance, for all its apparent irresistibility, was creating vulnerabilities that a skilled commander might exploit. The German armies were advancing on a broad front, but they were also becoming strung out over great distances. Supply lines were lengthening daily. Most critically of all, the great wheeling movement that formed the heart of the Schlieffen Plan was beginning to lose its cohesion. The sight of the spear of the Yao, as the first days of September 1914 dawned, the situation around Paris had reached a critical juncture. German spearheads were now less than 30 miles from the capital, close enough that the sound of artillery could be heard in the city's outskirts. The roads leading south from Paris were clogged with refugees fleeing the approaching armies. In the government buildings that the French leadership had not yet abandoned, staff officers worked feverishly to complete plans for the defense of the capital. At this moment of supreme crisis, 2 men would emerge whose partnership would prove crucial to France's salvation. The first was General Joseph Simon Gallieni, the newly appointed military governor of Paris. The second was General Michel-Joseph Montoury, commander of the French 6th Army, which had been hastily assembled to defend the capital. Gallieni was a colonial soldier, like Joffre, but his career had been spent in the far corners of the French Empire rather than in the comfortable staff positions of metropolitan France. He had pacified Madagascar, fought in Sudan, and learned his trade in the harsh school of colonial warfare, where innovation and improvisation were often more valuable than textbook tactics. At 65, he was older than most of his contemporaries, and his health was not good, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. When Gallieni took up his post as military governor of Paris on August 25, 1914, he found a city in the grip of uncertainty and fear. The government had already made contingency plans for evacuation, and many wealthy Parisians had already fled to the safety of the provinces. Gallieni's first task was to restore confidence and prepare the city for siege. He issued a proclamation that would become famous. "The hour has come to advance at all costs and to die where you stand rather than give way." But Gallieni was not content merely to prepare for a siege. As he studied the reports flowing in from the front, he began to perceive that the German advance, rapid though it was, might contain the seeds of its own destruction. The key lay in understanding the nature of the great wheeling movement that was bringing the German armies down upon Paris. The Schlieffen Plan had called for the German right wing to sweep west of Paris, enveloping the city and the French armies defending it. But as Gallieni studied his maps and intelligence reports, he began to realize that something had gone wrong with the German plan. Instead of passing west of Paris as originally intended, the German First Army under von Kluck was turning southeast, moving directly toward the capital, but leaving its right flank dangerously exposed. The flaw in the plan. The decision that would ultimately doom the Schlieffen Plan was made not in the comfortable offices of the German General Staff, but in the dust and chaos of the front lines. General von Kluck, commanding the German First Army, was a soldier of the old Prussian school, aggressive and confident in his abilities. As his army pressed southward in early September, he found himself faced with a tactical decision that would have strategic consequences far beyond his imagining. The original Schlieffen Plan had called for Kluck's army to sweep west of Paris, maintaining the great enveloping movement that was supposed to trap the French armies. But as Kluck pursued the retreating British expeditionary force and elements of the French Fifth Army, he became convinced that the enemy was more severely shaken than German intelligence had suggested. Rather than continuing his westward sweep, Kluck decided to turn his army southeast, directly toward Paris, in pursuit of what he believed to be a beaten enemy. It was a decision that seemed to make tactical sense, but violated the fundamental strategic concept of the Schlieffen Plan. By turning southeast instead of continuing west, Kluck was abandoning the envelopment that was supposed to ensure German victory. Worse still, he was creating a gap between his own army and the German Second Army under Bülow, a gap that an alert enemy might exploit. The decision was made all the more fateful by the state of German communications. The rapid advance had outstripped the army's ability to maintain reliable contact between its various units. Radio equipment was primitive and unreliable. Telephone lines had been cut by the retreating French, and dispatch riders often took hours or even days to deliver their messages. As a result, Kluck made his fateful decision without consulting either Bülow or the German High Command. When General Helmuth von Moltke, the German Chief of Staff, learned of Kluck's change of direction, he was faced with a terrible choice. He could order Kluck to resume the original plan, which would mean halting the advance and perhaps losing the momentum that had carried German arms to the brink of victory. Or he could accept Kluck's modification and hope that a direct assault on Paris would achieve the same result as the original envelopment. Fatally, Moltke chose a middle course, neither fully supporting Kluck's initiative nor ordering a return to the original plan. The result was confusion and uncertainty at the worst possible moment. The German armies continued their advance, but the clockwork precision that had characterized their earlier movements began to break down. Units became separated, communication failed, and most critically of all, the gap between the First and Second Armies began to widen. The eye of the storm. It was at this moment, as the German tide seemed about to engulf Paris, that General Gallieni made the observation that would change the course of the war. On September 3rd, as reports flowed into his headquarters at the Invalides, Gallieni noticed something that had escaped the attention of other French commanders. The German First Army was no longer advancing directly toward Paris. Instead, it was moving southeast, presenting its right flank to any French forces that might be positioned to attack it. Gallieni's military career had taught him to recognize opportunity when he saw it. Here was a chance to strike at the spearhead of the German advance, to turn the tide of battle at the moment when defeat seemed most certain. But Gallieni was not an army commander. He was military governor of Paris, responsible for the defense of the capital, but not for offensive operations. To act on his insight, he would need the cooperation of General Joffre and the support of the French Sixth Army under Marne. The relationship between Gallieni and Joffre was complex and sometimes strained. Gallieni was the senior of the two in age and experience, and many had expected him to be named commander-in-chief when the position became vacant in 1911. Instead, Gallieni had declined the appointment, citing his age and poor health, and had recommended Joffre for the position. Now, 3 years later, their roles were reversed, with Gallieni serving under the man he had once mentored. On the afternoon of September 3rd, Gallieni made a telephone call that would go down in military history. Speaking directly to Joffre, he outlined his perception of the opportunity presented by Kluck's change of direction. The German right flank was exposed, Gallieni argued, and a swift attack by the Sixth Army could strike a devastating blow against the German advance. But time was of the essence. Every hour of delay made the opportunity less promising. Joffre's initial response was cautious. The French armies had been falling back for weeks, and the idea of launching an offensive operation seemed almost impossible to contemplate. Moreover, the Sixth Army under Monnery was not yet fully concentrated and might not be ready for immediate action. But Gallieni persisted, using all his powers of persuasion to convince his former protégé that the moment for decisive action had arrived. The decision, the conversation between Gallieni and Joffre on September 3, 1914, was one of those pivotal moments when the fate of nations hangs on the words spoken between two men. Gallieni argued passionately for immediate action, insisting that the opportunity to strike at the German flank might not come again. Joffre, ever methodical, worried about the risks of premature action and the consequences of failure. The debate continued through the night and into the following day. Reports from the front continued to flow in, confirming Gallieni's assessment of the German change of direction, but also highlighting the precarious state of French forces. The British Expeditionary Force was exhausted and demoralized after weeks of retreat. The French Fifth Army had suffered heavy casualties and was barely holding together. Could such shaken forces really be expected to take the offensive against the victorious Germans? It was Joffre who finally made the decision that would determine the course of the battle, and perhaps the war. On the evening of September 4th, after consulting with his staff and considering all the factors involved, he gave the order for a general Allied offensive to begin on September 6th. The French Sixth Army would attack the exposed right flank of the German First Army, while the British Expeditionary Force and the French Fifth Army would advance into the gap that was opening between the German First and Second Armies. The decision required enormous courage. Joffre was ordering his battered armies to abandon the defensive positions they had been fighting so hard to reach and to take the offensive against an enemy that had seemed invincible only days before. If the attack failed, Paris would almost certainly fall, and with it, France might well be knocked out of the war. But if it succeeded, the German advance would be halted, and the Schlieffen Plan would be in ruins. To ensure that his commanders understood the gravity of the situation, Joffre issued an order that would become one of the most famous documents of the Great War. The hour has come to advance at all costs and to throw back the enemy. Troops that can no longer advance must, regardless of cost, hold the ground they have gained and die where they stand rather than give way. The gathering storm. As September 5th dawned, the preparations for what would become known as the First Battle of the Marne were entering their final phase. Along a front that stretched for more than 200 kilometers, from Paris to Verdun, French and British forces were preparing for what many realized might be the last desperate throw of the dice. If the offensive failed, there would be no second chance. The German armies were too close to Paris, and French reserves were too depleted for any further resistance to be possible. General Maunoury's 6th Army, which would bear the brunt of the initial attack against Kluck's exposed flank, was a hastily assembled force that reflected both the desperation and the determination of the French war effort. Its corps consisted of the 7th Corps under General Vautier and reserve divisions that had been rushed from various parts of France. To these were added territorial units, colonial troops from North Africa, and even a brigade of Marines who had been earmarked for service in Belgium before the German advance had made such operations impossible. The most colourful addition to Maunoury's force was the 45th Division of Zouaves, North African light infantry, whose distinctive uniforms and fierce reputation had made them legendary throughout the French Empire. As these exotic warriors marched through the streets of Paris on their way to the front, they caused a sensation among the civilian population. Their presence seemed to symbolize the determination of France to throw everything into the coming battle. But it was not just the composition of the 6th Army that reflected the improvisational nature of the French war effort. The very existence of the army was testimony to Joffre's skill in creating military units out of thin air when the situation demanded it. In the space of less than 2 weeks, he had assembled a force of nearly 150,000 men from units scattered across France and beyond. It was a remarkable achievement of military organization, made possible by France's excellent railway network and the determination of French soldiers to defend their homeland. Yet even as the 6th Army prepared for its assault on the German flank, its commanders were acutely aware that they faced a formidable enemy. The German First Army was not some demoralized rabble, but one of the finest military formations in the world. Its soldiers were veterans of the successful advance through Belgium and northern France. Their morale was high, their equipment was excellent, and their commanders were experienced professionals who had proven their skill in battle after battle. Moreover, the Germans held most of the tactical advantages. They occupied prepared positions on favorable ground. Their artillery was superior in both quality and quantity to anything the French could bring to bear. Most critically of all, they retained the initiative, and it would take extraordinary skill and courage for the French to wrest it away from them. The race against time. As the French preparations for the offensive continued, General Gallieni found himself facing a problem that would have seemed almost comical had the circumstances been less dire. The 6th Army was ready to attack, but getting it to the point of attack was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The French railway system, excellent though it was already strained to the breaking point by the demands of the war. Every available train was needed to move troops, supplies, and equipment to the front. There simply were not enough locomotives and carriages to transport all of Maunoury's forces to their designated positions in time for the planned offensive. It was in this context that Gallieni made the decision that would enshrine his name in military legend. If the railways could not transport all the troops he needed, then he would have to find alternative means of transportation. And as he looked out at the streets of Paris, the solution presented itself with startling obviousness: the city's fleet of taxicabs. Paris in 1914 boasted one of the world's largest fleets of motor taxis, nearly 10,000 vehicles that plied the city's streets day and night. The majority of these were Renault AG1 landolets, sturdy vehicles that could carry 4 or 5 passengers in addition to the driver. Under normal circumstances, these cabs served the civilian population of the capital, ferrying passengers from railway stations to hotels, from shops to restaurants, from one appointment to another. But these were not normal circumstances, and Gallieni was not a man to be deterred by conventional thinking. The idea of using civilian vehicles for military transport was not entirely unprecedented. As early as August 1914, military authorities had occasionally requisitioned private automobiles for various purposes. But the scale of what Gallieni now proposed was unprecedented. He was talking about commandeering hundreds of taxis and using them to transport an entire division of infantry to the front lines. It was an idea so audacious that it would surely have been rejected under normal circumstances. But with the fate of Paris hanging in the balance, audacity seemed the most reasonable course of action. The practical challenges were enormous. How many taxis would be needed? How would they be assembled and organized? Who would coordinate their movement? How would the drivers be compensated? These were questions that would normally require weeks of planning and preparation, but Gallieni had only hours to find answers. Working through the night of September 5th to 6th, Gallieni's staff began the complex task of organizing what would become known as the taxicab army. Police were dispatched throughout Paris with orders to requisition every available taxi. Drivers were told that their vehicles were needed for military service and that they would be compensated for their time and fuel. Assembly points were designated where the taxis would gather before proceeding to collect their military passengers. The summons, the scene that unfolded in Paris during the evening and night of September 5th to 6th, 1914, was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. Across the capital, police officers and military personnel were stopping taxis in the middle of their normal operations, asking passengers to disembark, and directing the vehicles toward designated assembly points. The reaction of the taxi drivers themselves was mixed. Some embraced the opportunity to serve their country in its hour of need. Others grumbled about the disruption to their livelihoods and demanded assurances about compensation. The largest assembly point was the Esplanade des Invalides, the great open space in front of the military complex that housed Napoleon's tomb and the headquarters of the French army. As darkness fell, hundreds of taxis began to converge on this historic site, their headlights creating a constellation of light in the Parisian night. It was a sight that would have been impossible to imagine even a few weeks earlier, when the peaceful routines of civilian life had still seemed unshakable. The soldiers who would be transported by these improvised vehicles were men of the 103rd and 104th Infantry Regiments, reserve formations that had been hastily recalled to active duty as the German threat to Paris had developed. Many were older men, veterans of France's colonial wars, or former conscripts who had completed their military service and returned to civilian life. They had been called back to the colours in France's hour of need, leaving behind their families, their jobs, and their normal lives to take up arms once again in defence of their homeland. As the soldiers gathered at their designated pickup points throughout Paris, they too witnessed scenes that would remain etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. Paris, in September 1914, was a city transformed by war. The broad boulevards that had once been filled with strolling couples and window shoppers now echoed with the sound of marching feet and military vehicles. Shop windows were dark, their owners having fled to the provinces or boarded up their premises in anticipation of siege. The cafes and restaurants that had once made Paris famous throughout the world were either closed or serving as makeshift shelters for refugees from the battle zones. Yet, despite the obvious signs of crisis, there was also an atmosphere of grim determination that impressed many observers. Parisians had not fled en masse as some had predicted they would. Instead, they remained at their posts, whether as policemen organising the taxi requisition, as railway workers keeping the trains running, or as ordinary citizens determined to see their city through its greatest trial. The sight of these humble taxi cabs being pressed into military service seemed to embody the spirit of a people who would use whatever means were available to defend their freedom. The night drive. At approximately 10 p.m. on September 6, 1914, the first convoy of taxis began its journey from Paris to the front lines. It was a procession unlike any in military history. Hundreds of civilian vehicles, normally used for the mundane business of urban transportation, now carrying soldiers toward what might well be the decisive battle of the war. Each taxi carried 4 or 5 fully equipped infantrymen, their rifles and equipment crammed into the passenger compartments of vehicles that had never been designed for such purposes. The route taken by the taxi convoy led northeast from Paris, through the suburbs and into the countryside of the Île-de-France. The The roads were not designed for heavy military traffic, and the convoy had to proceed carefully to avoid accidents that might disrupt the entire operation. The drivers, many of whom had never ventured far from the familiar streets of Paris, found themselves navigating country roads by moonlight and starlight, guided by military officers who were often no more familiar with the terrain than they were. The soldiers themselves endured the journey with the stoic patience that has always characterized the French infantry. Crammed into the back seats of the taxis, weighed down by their equipment and weapons, they had little choice but to make the best of an uncomfortable situation. Some dozed fitfully as the vehicles bounced along the rough roads. Others stared out at the dark countryside, perhaps wondering what dawn would bring and whether they would live to see another sunset. The drivers of the taxis faced their own challenges. Most were civilians with no military training, thrust suddenly into a situation for which nothing in their peacetime experience had prepared them. They had to navigate unfamiliar roads in darkness, maintain their position in the convoy, and cope with the knowledge that they were carrying men toward a battle that might determine the fate of their country. Some rose magnificently to the occasion, treating their mission with the seriousness it deserved. Others struggled with the stress and uncertainty of their unprecedented role. The destination of this remarkable convoy was the small town of Nanteuil-le-Haudouin, some 50 kilometers northeast of Paris. Here, the soldiers would disembark and march the final few kilometers to their positions on the left flank of Maunery's 6th Army. It was here that they would take their place in the line of battle that would determine whether the German advance could be stopped or whether Paris would fall to the invader. As the taxis made their way through the French countryside, carrying their precious cargo toward the sound of the guns, they were participating in something far greater than a mere transportation operation. They were part of a desperate gamble, a last throw of the dice by a nation that had been pushed to the brink of defeat but refused to surrender. The taxi drivers, soldiers, and passengers who participated in this extraordinary journey could not have known that they were making history, but history was precisely what they were making. Dawn on the Marne. As the first light of September 6, 1914, began to creep across the fields and forests of northern France, the stage was set for one of the most crucial battles in human history. Along a front that stretched from the outskirts of Paris to the fortress city of Verdun, more than 1 million men were preparing for combat. The German armies, confident after weeks of victory, were positioned for what they believed would be the final assault that would bring the war to a victorious conclusion. Facing them, the French and British forces were preparing for what many realized might be their last chance to save Paris and keep France in the war. The 3,000 soldiers who had been transported to the front by Gallieni's taxicabs were taking their positions on the extreme left of the French line, where Maunery's 6th Army was preparing to launch its attack against the exposed flank of Kluck's 1st Army. These men, many of them reservists who had been called back from civilian life, represented both the desperation and the determination of the French war effort. They were not elite troops. They lacked the training and experience of their German opponents. But they possessed something that would prove equally valuable in the coming battle: the knowledge that they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. The taxi drivers who had brought them to this place were beginning their return journey to Paris, their mission completed. As their vehicles disappeared into the morning mist, they left behind them soldiers who would soon test themselves against one of the finest armies in the world. For many of these men, it would be their first taste of combat. For others, it would be their last. The strategic situation as dawn broke on September 6th was complex and fluid. The German advance had succeeded beyond even Schlieffen's most optimistic projections, but success had brought its own problems. The German armies were strung out over vast distances, their supply lines stretched thin, their communications unreliable. Most critically of all, Kluck's change of direction had created exactly the kind of opportunity that Gallieni and Joffre were now preparing to exploit. The French plan was ambitious, but risky. Monuri's 6th Army would attack Kluck's exposed right flank, forcing the German commander to turn his forces to meet this unexpected threat. At the same time, the British Expeditionary Force and the French 5th Army would advance into the gap that was opening between the German 1st and 2nd Armies. If all went according to plan, the German advance would be halted and perhaps even thrown back. If the plan failed, Paris would fall within days. The battle begins. The first shots of what would become known as the Battle of the Marne were fired at dawn on September 6, 1914, as advance elements of Monuri's 6th Army made contact with German outposts along the Ourcq River. The sound of rifle fire, echoing across the peaceful farmland of the Île-de-France, marked the beginning of a battle that would rage for 6 days and ultimately determine the fate of France. The soldiers who had been transported to the front by taxi found themselves in the thick of the action almost immediately. As part of the 6th Army's offensive against Kluck's flank, they were ordered to advance across open ground toward German positions that had been hastily fortified during the night. It was a daunting task for any soldiers, but particularly challenging for reservists who had been thrust into combat with little time for preparation. The German response to the French attack was swift and professional. Kluck, recognizing the threat to his flank, began redeploying his forces to meet Monuri's assault. German artillery, superior in both quality and quantity to its French counterpart, opened fire on the advancing French infantry. Machine guns, that terrible new weapon that would come to define the Great War, chattered their deadly song as French soldiers pressed forward across the killing ground. Yet despite the ferocity of the German resistance, the French attack achieved its primary objective. By threatening Kluck's flank, Monuri had forced the German commander to halt his advance toward Paris and turn his attention to this unexpected threat. More critically still, Kluck's redeployment widened the gap between his 1st Army and Bülow's 2nd Army, creating exactly the opportunity that Joffre had hoped to exploit. The fighting on September 6th was fierce but inconclusive. Neither side achieved a decisive advantage, and as night fell, both armies prepared for renewed combat on the following day. The French attack had been costly. Hundreds of men had fallen in the first day's fighting, but it had succeeded in its strategic purpose. The German advance on Paris had been halted, and the initiative was beginning to shift to the French. Among the casualties of that first day's fighting were some of the men who had been transported to the front by taxi. They had travelled from the familiar streets of Paris to die in the fields of the Marne, far from their homes and families. Their sacrifice, made in the service of a cause greater than themselves, was part of the price that France would pay for survival. The widening gap. As the battle continued into its second day, the strategic situation began to evolve in ways that would prove decisive for the outcome of the campaign. Kluck's redeployment to meet Monuri's attack had indeed created a gap between the German 1st and 2nd Armies, but exploiting that gap would require coordination and timing that tested the limits of Allied capabilities. The British Expeditionary Force, commanded by Field Marshal Sir John French, had been badly mauled during the retreat from Mons and was operating at barely half its original strength. French himself had lost confidence in his French allies and was reluctant to commit his forces to what seemed like another desperate venture. It took a personal appeal from Joffre, delivered with tears in his eyes and passionate pleas about the honour of England, to convince the British commander to participate in the offensive. Once committed, however, the British forces performed with their characteristic steadiness under fire. The BEF advanced into the gap between the German armies with methodical precision, their professional soldiers making up in skill and discipline what they lacked in numbers. Supporting them on their right flank was the French 5th Army under General Franchet d'Espèrey, a commander whom Joffre had recently appointed to replace the more cautious General Lanrezac. D'Espèrey was exactly the kind of aggressive leader that Joffre needed for this critical moment. Where Lanrezac had been cautious and defensive-minded, Desperé was eager to take the fight to the enemy. His army advanced with vigor and determination, pushing deeper into the gap between the German forces and threatening to break the German line entirely. The Germans, for their part, found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. Moltke, directing the battle from his headquarters in Luxembourg, was receiving fragmentary and often contradictory reports from his army commanders. Communications had broken down almost entirely, leaving the German Supreme Command effectively blind to the developing situation. When Moltke finally grasped the seriousness of the Allied counteroffensive, it was almost too late to respond effectively. The crisis deepens. By September 8th, the third day of the battle, it was becoming clear that the German position was becoming untenable. The gap between the First and Second Armies had widened to nearly 30 miles, and Allied forces were pouring through this breach like water through a broken dam. Kluck found himself fighting on two fronts, against Maunery's 6th Army on his right flank and against the British and French forces advancing through the gap on his left. The situation was made worse by the continuing breakdown of German communications. Radio equipment, primitive by later standards, was proving unreliable under battlefield conditions. Telephone lines had been cut by Allied forces or destroyed by artillery fire. Dispatch riders took hours to cover distances that could have been traversed in minutes under peacetime conditions. As a result, German commanders were operating in virtual isolation, unable to coordinate their actions or respond effectively to rapidly changing circumstances. It was under these circumstances that one of the most famous incidents of the entire battle took place. On the afternoon of September 8th, General Gallieni received reports that German pressure on Maunery's 6th Army was intensifying and that French forces were in danger of being overwhelmed. Additional reinforcements were urgently needed, but the railway system was already operating at maximum capacity and could not transport troops quickly enough to affect the immediate situation. Once again, Gallieni turned to the improvised solution that had already served him so well. If the railways could not provide the needed transportation, then the taxicabs of Paris would have to fill the gap. For the second time in 3 days, police were dispatched throughout the capital with orders to requisition every available taxi. Once again, hundreds of vehicles converged on assembly points throughout the city, ready to carry French soldiers toward the sound of the guns. This second requisition of taxis was smaller in scale than the first, involving perhaps 300 vehicles rather than the 600 or more that had been used on September 6th. But it was no less significant in its psychological impact. The sight of taxicabs once again being pressed into military service reinforced the impression that the entire French nation was mobilizing in defense of its capital. Every available resource, no matter how humble or unconventional, was being thrown into the desperate struggle to save Paris. The turning of the tide, the additional troops transported by the second taxi requisition arrived at the front just as the crisis was reaching its peak. Maunery's 6th Army was under severe pressure from Kluck's counterattacks, and there were moments when it seemed that the German 1st Army might break through the French line and resume its advance on Paris. The arrival of fresh troops, even in relatively small numbers, helped to stabilize the situation and maintain the pressure on the German flank. But the real turning point in the battle came not from any single tactical action, but from the cumulative effect of the Allied offensive on German morale and capabilities. The German armies, which had advanced with such confidence and elan through Belgium and northern France, were beginning to show signs of strain. Weeks of continuous marching and fighting had exhausted even the most disciplined soldiers. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point were failing to provide adequate food, ammunition, and equipment. Most critically of all, the psychological advantage that had sustained German forces through their early victories was beginning to erode. The German soldiers who had crossed the Belgian frontier on August 4th had been told that they would be home before the leaves fell. They had been promised a swift and decisive victory that would establish German dominance over Europe and ensure their nation's place in the sun. Instead, they found themselves locked in a desperate battle for survival against enemies who refused to accept defeat. The contrast between expectation and reality was beginning to take its toll. General von Moltke, observing the deteriorating situation from his distant headquarters, finally recognized that the Schlieffen Plan had failed. The great enveloping movement that was supposed to crush French resistance had bogged down in a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. On September 9th, he issued the order that effectively ended Germany's hopes for a quick victory. The German armies were to withdraw to more defensible positions north of the Marne River. The retreat. The German withdrawal from the Marne marked the end of the greatest crisis in French history since the dark days of 1870. The armies that had seemed invincible only days before were now falling back in disorder, abandoning their positions and retreating toward the Aisne River. The retreat was conducted with the discipline that characterized German military operations, but it was a retreat nonetheless, and its psychological impact was enormous. For the French and British forces pursuing the retiring Germans, the sudden change in their fortunes seemed almost miraculous. Soldiers who had been in retreat for weeks were now advancing, reclaiming territory that had been given up for lost. The roads that had been clogged with refugees fleeing the German advance were now filled with Allied troops moving forward to exploit their victory. The pursuit was hampered by the exhaustion of the Allied forces, who had been fighting almost continuously for 6 days. The French and British armies had suffered heavy casualties, and many units were operating at well below their authorized strength. Moreover, the Germans conducted their withdrawal skillfully, destroying bridges and railways to slow their pursuers and establishing strong rearguard positions that inflicted further casualties on the advancing Allies. Nevertheless, the strategic consequences of the German defeat were immense. The Schlieffen Plan, the cornerstone of German strategy for nearly a decade, lay in ruins. The hope of a quick victory over France had vanished, replaced by the grim prospect of a long war of attrition. Most critically of all, the German withdrawal allowed France to remain in the war, ensuring that Germany would indeed face the two-front conflict that Schlieffen had sought so desperately to avoid. The reckoning. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of the Marne, both sides began to assess the cost and consequences of the 6-day struggle that had determined the fate of France. The casualties were staggering by the standards of any previous conflict. French losses alone exceeded 80,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, while British casualties numbered in the thousands. German losses were somewhat lighter, but still substantial, and included thousands of prisoners taken during the retreat. But it was not just the human cost that made the Battle of the Marne so significant. The battle had demonstrated that the German army, for all its skill and professionalism, was not invincible. The aura of superiority that had surrounded German arms since the victories of 1870 had been shattered on the fields of the Marne. More importantly still, the battle had shown that France, despite the disasters of August, retained the will and capability to defend herself. The role of the taxicabs in the battle quickly became the stuff of legend. The sight of humble Parisian taxis carrying soldiers to the front captured the imagination of a world hungry for symbols of heroism and sacrifice. Newspaper reports spoke of the miracle of the Marne and credited the taxi drivers with saving Paris from the German invader. The story was told and retold, embellished with each telling, until it became one of the most famous episodes of the entire war. The reality, as is often the case with wartime legends, was more complex than the myth. The approximately 6,000 soldiers transported by taxi represented only a tiny fraction of the forces engaged in the battle. The vast majority of French reinforcements reached the front by railway, as they had throughout the campaign. The taxis were an improvisation, a creative solution to a temporary transportation problem, but they were not the decisive factor in the French victory. Yet the symbolic importance of the taxis far exceeded their tactical significance. They represented the determination of the French people to use every available resource in defense of their homeland. They embodied the spirit of improvisation and adaptability that would prove crucial in the long struggle ahead. Most importantly, they demonstrated that in a war between nations, victory would go not just to those with the best armies, but to those with the greatest will to win. The price of victory. The French government, which had fled to Bordeaux at the height of the crisis, returned to Paris in triumph, but the victory had come at an enormous cost. The Battle of the Marne had saved France from immediate defeat, but it had not ended the war. If anything, it had ensured that the conflict would continue for years to come, consuming the lives and resources of all the combatant nations. The German retreat stopped north of the Aisne River, where the exhausted armies of both sides began the process of digging in that would characterize the remainder of the war on the Western Front. The fluid, mobile warfare that had marked the opening weeks of the conflict gave way to the static, attritional struggle of trench warfare. The front lines that were established in September 1914 would remain essentially unchanged for the next 4 years, despite offensives that cost millions of lives. For the taxi drivers who had participated in the Great Adventure, life gradually returned to normal. The French military, true to its word, compensated the drivers for their service, paying the equivalent of 70 on 102 francs for the journeys to and from the front. The amount, substantial by the standards of the time, represented not just payment for transportation services, but recognition of the driver's contribution to the national defense. Some of the taxis that had served in the battle were preserved as monuments to the event. 2 Renault G7 taxis from the Marne operation were acquired for display in French museums, where they remain to this day as tangible reminders of one of the most unusual military operations in history. These modest vehicles, originally designed for the mundane business of urban transportation, had become artifacts of national significance. The legend lives on. In the years following the Battle of the Marne, the story of the taxicabs grew in the telling. French writers and historians embellished the tale, transforming a limited transportation operation into a decisive factor in the battle. The number of taxis involved grew in various accounts, as did their importance in achieving victory. The drivers were portrayed as heroes who had volunteered for dangerous service, rather than civilians who had been compelled to participate in a military operation. The legend was given new life during the dark days of 1940, when France once again faced German invasion. Writers and politicians invoked the memory of the taxis of the Marne as a symbol of French determination and ingenuity. The message was clear. Just as humble taxi drivers had helped save Paris in 1914, so the common people of France could find ways to resist the Nazi occupation. After the Second World War, the story of the taxis continued to evolve. In 1957, French author Jean Dutourd published a novel titled The Taxis of the Marne that became a bestseller both in France and abroad. Dutourd's book was not really about the 1914 battle, but rather a meditation on French national character and the contrast between the heroic generation of 1914 and what he saw as the defeated generation of 1940. The enduring appeal of the taxi story lies in its combination of the heroic and the everyday. The great battles of history are usually remembered for the exploits of generals and the sacrifices of soldiers. The taxis of the Marne represent something different, the contribution of ordinary civilians to extraordinary events. The drivers who transported soldiers to the front were not professional warriors, but working men doing their jobs under unusual circumstances. The broader context. To understand the true significance of the taxis of the Marne, it is necessary to place them in the broader context of the Great War and its impact on French society. The war that began in August 1914 was unlike any previous conflict in its scale, intensity, and demands on civilian populations. It was, in the words of one historian, the first total war, requiring the mobilization not just of armies but of entire nations. In this new kind of warfare, the distinction between combatants and civilians became increasingly blurred. Factory workers producing munitions were as essential to victory as the soldiers who fired them. Farmers growing food for the armies were as crucial as the generals who planned campaigns. Women taking over jobs traditionally performed by men were as important as the men they replaced. The taxi drivers who carried soldiers to the Marne were part of this broader mobilization of civil society in support of the war effort. The improvised nature of the taxi operation also reflected the broader character of the Great War, which constantly demanded new solutions to unprecedented problems. The generals who planned the conflict had prepared for a war that would be fought according to familiar patterns, but the reality of industrial warfare forced constant innovation and adaptation. From the tactical level, where soldiers learned to cope with machine guns and poison gas, to the strategic level, where governments learned to manage war economies, the conflict was characterized by trial and error, success and failure, triumph and tragedy. The taxis of the Marne represented this spirit of improvisation at its best. Faced with a transportation crisis that threatened to derail a crucial military operation, Gallieni found a creative solution using resources that were readily available. The operation succeeded not because it was carefully planned and executed according to established doctrine, but because it was adapted to the specific circumstances of the moment. The human cost. Behind the legend of the taxis lies a more sobering reality: the enormous human cost of the Battle of the Marne and the wider conflict of which it was a part. The 6,000 soldiers transported by taxi were just a tiny fraction of the millions of men who would die in the trenches of the Western Front over the next 4 years. Many of the men who rode in those taxis in September 1914 would not live to see the end of the war. The Battle of the Marne itself claimed over 250,000 casualties from all sides, making it one of the bloodiest single engagements in military history up to that point. Yet it would be dwarfed by later battles like Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele, each of which consumed hundreds of thousands of lives for gains that could be measured in yards rather than miles. The taxi drivers themselves were civilians caught up in events beyond their control. Many had no desire to participate in military operations and grumbled about the disruption to their livelihoods. Some worried about the dangers of approaching the battle zone, while others were concerned about compensation for their time and fuel. Their participation in the operation was largely involuntary, the result of government requisition rather than patriotic enthusiasm. Yet despite these mundane concerns, the drivers performed their assigned tasks with the competence and professionalism that the situation demanded. They navigated unfamiliar roads in darkness, maintained their positions in convoy, and delivered their passengers safely to their destinations. In doing so, they made their own small contribution to one of the most significant military victories in French history. The strategic consequences. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan at the Marne had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Germany's inability to achieve a quick victory over France meant that the war would continue, with all the catastrophic consequences that prolonged conflict would bring. The two-front war that Schlieffen had sought to avoid became an unavoidable reality, draining German resources and ultimately contributing to the Central Powers' defeat. For France, victory at the Marne meant survival, but it also meant 4 more years of devastating warfare on French soil. The northern and eastern provinces of the country would become a vast battlefield, with ancient cities and towns reduced to rubble, and millions of acres of farmland rendered uninhabitable. The human and economic costs of the war would cripple France for a generation and contribute to the political instability that would plague the country between the wars. The international consequences were equally significant. Britain's entry into the war, triggered by the German invasion of Belgium, transformed a European conflict into a global struggle. The British Empire's resources were thrown into the balance, while the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany began the slow process of economic strangulation that would eventually contribute to German defeat. The war's expansion also drew in other powers. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on Germany's side, opening new fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. Italy eventually joined the Allies, creating yet another theatre of operations. Most critically of all, the United States would eventually be drawn into the conflict, providing the fresh manpower and industrial capacity that would prove decisive in the war's final phase. Technological innovation. The Great War was not just a conflict between nations, but also a laboratory for technological innovation. The demands of warfare drove rapid advances in everything from weapons and communications to transportation and medical care. The use of civilian vehicles for military transport, as demonstrated by the taxis of the Marne, was an early example of this technological adaptation. The war saw the first widespread use of motor vehicles in military operations. While horses and railways remained important throughout the conflict, trucks, cars, and motorcycles played an increasingly significant role in moving troops and supplies. The taxi operation at the Marne was a harbinger of this motorized warfare, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of wheeled transport in military operations. Aircraft too evolved rapidly during the war. The primitive flying machines of 1914 gave way to sophisticated fighters and bombers by 1918. Radio communication, though still unreliable, began to replace visual signals and dispatch riders as the primary means of battlefield communication. New weapons like machine guns, poison gas, and tanks transformed tactics and strategy. The war also drove advances in less obvious areas. Medical care improved dramatically as doctors learned to treat wounds and diseases that had previously been fatal. Industrial production methods were revolutionized as factories adapted to wartime demands. Even social organization changed as women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and governments learned to manage entire economies. The memory of war. The story of the taxis of the Marne became part of the larger narrative of French resistance and resilience that would sustain the nation through the dark years ahead. During the Second World War, when France again faced German invasion and occupation, the memory of 1914 provided both inspiration and reproach. The generation that had saved Paris with taxicabs seemed to represent a heroic past that contrasted sharply with the reality of defeat in 1940. This comparison was not entirely fair. The France of 1940 faced a very different enemy, employing radically different tactics. The Blitzkrieg warfare that conquered France in 6 weeks bore little resemblance to the methodical advance of 1914. The German army of 1940 was equipped with tanks and aircraft that made the weapons of 1914 seem primitive by comparison. Most importantly, the strategic situation was fundamentally different, with France lacking the allies and resources that had sustained her in the earlier conflict. Nevertheless, the memory of the taxis served as a reminder of what was possible when a nation mobilized all its resources in defense of freedom. The story inspired resistance fighters and gave hope to those who refused to accept defeat as final. It became part of the mythology of France, a symbol of national character that transcended the specific circumstances of its origin. Lessons learned. The improvisational success of the taxi operation at the Marne taught military planners several important lessons about modern warfare. First, it demonstrated the importance of flexibility and adaptability in military operations. The rigid adherence to predetermined plans, which had characterized much 19th century warfare, was insufficient for the dynamic conditions of industrial conflict. Second, the operation showed the potential value of civilian resources in military operations. The distinction between military and civilian assets became increasingly blurred as warfare became more total in character. Governments learned to harness industrial production, transportation networks, and even popular morale in support of military objectives. Third, the taxi operation highlighted the importance of logistics in modern warfare. The best strategic plans could fail if armies could not be supplied, equipped, and reinforced when necessary. The ability to move troops rapidly from one sector to another often proved more valuable than tactical brilliance on the battlefield. Finally, the operation demonstrated the role of leadership in crisis situations. Gallieni's decision to use civilian taxis was not the result of careful planning, but of quick thinking under pressure. Military leaders had to be prepared to make unconventional decisions when conventional solutions proved inadequate. The enduring symbolism. More than a century after the Battle of the Marne, the story of the taxicabs continues to resonate with audiences around the world. The image of humble civilian vehicles pressed into military service captures something essential about the nature of democratic societies at war. In contrast to authoritarian regimes that rely on coercion and compulsion, democracies depend on the voluntary cooperation of their citizens. The taxi drivers who carried soldiers to the Marne were not volunteers in the traditional sense. They were compelled to participate by government requisition. Yet they performed their duties without sabotage or resistance, contributing to the success of an operation that helped save their country. Their behavior reflected the kind of civic responsibility that is essential to democratic governance and military effectiveness. The story also speaks to the importance of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. History is often written as if it were made solely by great leaders and famous generals, but the reality is that historical outcomes depend on the actions of countless individuals whose names are never recorded. The taxi drivers of the Marne represent all those anonymous contributors to historical events, the people whose individual actions, however small, combine to create larger patterns of success or failure. Technical details. The vehicles that carried French soldiers to the Battle of the Marne were mostly Renault AG1 landolets, sturdy automobiles that represented the cutting edge of automotive technology in 1914. These vehicles were powered by two-cylinder engines that produced about 8 horsepower, giving them a top speed of approximately 25 kilometers per hour on good roads. They could carry 4 or 5 passengers in addition to the driver, though the soldiers' equipment made for cramped conditions. The reliability of these early automobiles was still questionable by modern standards. Mechanical breakdowns were common, tire punctures were frequent, and the vehicles required constant maintenance to keep running. The fact that the taxi operation succeeded despite these limitations speaks to both the quality of the vehicles and the skill of their drivers. The routes taken by the taxi convoys led through the countryside northeast of Paris, over roads that were not designed for heavy traffic. The drivers had to navigate by map and compass, as modern navigation aids did not yet exist. Communication between vehicles was limited to visual signals, and there was no way for the convoy commanders to maintain contact with their headquarters once the journey began. The fuel requirements for the operation were substantial by the standards of the time. Each vehicle required several gallons of gasoline for the round trip, and fuel had to be provided at the destination for the return journey. The logistics of organizing fuel supplies, driver meals, and vehicle maintenance added complexity to an already challenging operation. Economic impact. The requisition of taxis for military service had immediate economic consequences for both the drivers and the taxi companies. The drivers lost income from their normal passenger service, while the companies had to cope with the disruption of their operations. The French government's promise to compensate the drivers helped mitigate these effects. But the payments did not fully cover all costs and losses. The total cost of the taxi operation, 70,102 francs, was substantial by the standards of 1914. To put this amount in perspective, it represented several months' wages for a typical industrial worker. The payment was made based on the meter readings of the taxis, calculated at normal commercial rates rather than special military rates. The economic impact extended beyond the immediate costs of the operation. The success of the taxi requisition demonstrated the government's ability to mobilize civilian resources for military purposes, setting a precedent for the total war economy that would develop over the following years. Businesses throughout France would find their operations increasingly subject to government control as the war continued. International reactions. News of the taxi operation quickly spread beyond France, capturing the imagination of allies and neutrals around the world. British newspapers praised the ingenuity and determination of the French, while American reporters described the operation as a symbol of democratic resilience. The story was particularly popular in countries where automobiles were still novelties, making the use of taxis for military transport seem especially exotic and innovative. German reactions were more mixed. Some German commentators dismissed the taxi operation as a publicity stunt, arguing that such improvised measures demonstrated French weakness rather than strength. Others recognized the operation as evidence of French determination to continue fighting despite military setbacks. The international coverage of the taxi operation helped establish it as one of the most famous episodes of the early war. Newspapers and magazines around the world published accounts of the miracle of the Marne, often embellishing the details to make the story more dramatic. This publicity contributed to the mythologization of the event and helped ensure its place in popular memory. Military analysis. From a purely military perspective, the contribution of the taxi-transported troops to the Battle of the Marne was minimal. The 6,000 soldiers carried by the vehicles represented less than half of 1% of the total forces engaged in the battle. Their arrival at the front did not change the overall balance of forces in any significant way, nor did it provide capabilities that were not already available through other means. However, the tactical impact of the operation should not be dismissed entirely. The troops arrived at exactly the moment when Maulnouri's 6th Army was under severe pressure from German counterattacks. Even a small reinforcement could make a significant difference in a close-fought engagement, providing just enough additional strength to maintain positions that might otherwise have been abandoned. More importantly, the strategic impact of the operation extended far beyond its immediate tactical effects. The taxi operation demonstrated French willingness to use every available resource in defense of Paris, sending a powerful message to both allies and enemies about French determination to continue fighting. This psychological effect may have been worth more than the purely military contribution of the transported troops. Military historians continue to debate the overall significance of the taxi operation within the broader context of the Battle of the Marne. While few would argue that the taxis were decisive in determining the outcome of the battle, most acknowledge that the operation represented an important example of military innovation and adaptability under pressure. Cultural legacy. The story of the taxis of the Marne has left an indelible mark on French culture and collective memory. The operation has been commemorated in books, films, songs, and monuments, becoming one of the most enduring symbols of French resistance and ingenuity. Schoolchildren in France learn about the taxi operation as part of their history curriculum, ensuring that the story continues to be passed down to new generations. The cultural impact extends beyond France to other countries that face similar challenges during the two world wars. The image of civilian vehicles pressed into military service resonated with populations that experienced the mobilization of their entire societies for war. The taxi story became a symbol of the kind of creative problem-solving and community cooperation that total war demanded. Artists and writers have found inspiration in the taxi story for more than a century. The operation has been depicted in paintings, sculptures, novels, and films, each interpretation adding new layers of meaning to the original event. These artistic representations have helped keep the story alive in popular consciousness and have contributed to its evolution from historical fact to cultural myth. Conclusion: the road home. As the last of the taxis made their way back to Paris in the early hours of September 7th, 1914, their drivers could hardly have imagined that they had participated in one of the most famous military operations in history. For them, it had been a night's work, difficult and dangerous perhaps, but hardly more extraordinary than the many other disruptions that war had brought to their daily lives. Yet their journey through the French countryside, carrying soldiers toward the sound of the guns, had indeed made history. Not because their contribution was decisive in military terms, it was not, but because it represented something larger and more important than any single tactical operation. The taxis of the Marne embodied the spirit of a nation at war, the willingness of ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices in defense of their freedom and way of life. The Battle of the Marne that followed would determine the course of the Great War and the fate of millions. The German advance would be halted, the Schlieffen Plan would fail, and the war would settle into the bloody stalemate of trench warfare that would characterize the Western Front for the next 4 years. France would survive, but at a cost that would scar the nation for generations. In the larger narrative of that terrible conflict, the taxi operation occupies a unique place. It represents a moment when the improvised ingenuity of democracy proved superior to the methodical planning of autocracy. It shows how ordinary citizens, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, can rise to meet challenges that would have seemed impossible under normal conditions. The drivers who answered the call that September night did not think of themselves as heroes. They were working men doing their jobs under difficult circumstances, concerned about their vehicles, their compensation, and their safety. Yet in performing those jobs with competence and determination, they made their own contribution to one of the most important military victories in French history. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by the famous and powerful, but by countless individuals whose names are never recorded, but whose actions, collectively, determine the fate of nations. The taxis of the Marne stand as a monument to all those anonymous contributors to historical events, the ordinary people who, in moments of crisis, prove capable of extraordinary things. As we look back more than a century later at that remarkable night when Parisian taxicabs carried French soldiers toward the battle that would save their capital and their country, we are reminded of the enduring power of human ingenuity, determination, and sacrifice. The miracle of the Marne was not just that Paris was saved, but that it was saved by people who refused to accept defeat, who found solutions when none seemed to exist, and who proved that sometimes the most unlikely heroes can change the course of history. The gentle hum of those taxi engines, carrying their precious cargo through the darkness toward an uncertain dawn, echoes still across the years. It speaks to us of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of innovation born of desperation, and of the unbreakable bond between a people and their homeland. In that sound, we hear not just the story of a single night in September 1914, but the voice of democracy itself, quietly determined, endlessly resourceful, and utterly unyielding in the face of those who would destroy it. And so, the taxis returned to Paris as the sun rose on September 7th, their mission complete, their place in history assured. The drivers resumed their normal routes through the familiar streets of the capital, carrying passengers to railway stations and hotels, shops and restaurants, as they had done before the war and would do again when peace returned. But they carried with them forever the knowledge that they had been present at one of history's great turning points, that they had played their part in the salvation of France. The miracle of the Marne was many things: a triumph of military leadership, a testament to French resilience, a demonstration of Allied cooperation. But perhaps above all, it was a reminder that in the darkest hours of crisis, salvation can come from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes, when the fate of nations hangs in the balance, it is not the generals or the politicians who make the difference, but the humble taxi drivers who answer the call to serve and, in doing so, help to save the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most remarkable nights. If you enjoyed this story of courage, ingenuity, and determination, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales from the annals of military history. Until next time, sleep well. Until next time,